Okay, this is the Kik website at kik.co, and I'm going to walk through and point out some things I like. The first one is that the gradient on this title I think works relatively well. You might not have noticed it at first, but there's a dark color on the left and then it gets lighter on the right. And I see this on other websites like Linear, but they tend to be dark mode, and so they're using white titles with a lighter to darker gradient. It's sort of the reverse. I think it works quite well here, perhaps because it's a light mode website and this is still quite readable. In the reverse situation, I think it sometimes gets a bit harder to read. This grid effect in the background jumps out at me. I quite like that it draws the eye forwards and downwards because it's this sort of forced perspective. But I also like that because it's a grid, it's suggesting spreadsheets to me, which is in line with bookkeeping as a concept. So this has both got a practical effect of drawing the eye downwards, but it's also quite thematically appropriate. The buttons, or the main call to actions on this website, have a hover effect, which I quite like. You can see there's a slight bounce of the text when I hover over it. It gets the dark to light gradient, and the arrow here gets a stem when you hover over it. So these are minor effects, but they add quite a bit of fun to the an otherwise relatively plain website. I noticed that if you look here, the 5 next to careers, here the new next to real-time profit and loss, and here these sparkles next to reserve $5,000. They're all used, as far as I can tell, to represent something new or something that deserves your attention. And so I quite like even though these are 3 different sort of contexts or situations, they are consistently using blue to grab your eye and say, hey, this is worth your attention. Moving down here, you get into these sort of feature containers. I've noticed that on some websites, they'll have this sort of content inside a container, and they will have a bit of extra space maybe to the left here, for example, where the content below the text won't necessarily be nicely aligned. On this website, they've gone to the effort to make all of this content quite nicely aligned. And that's quite nice because it feels as if these containers are a bit more full, a bit more orderly. I suspect this is actually a hard thing to pull off, especially when the content is this varied. There must have been a lot of tweaking and redoing the illustrations. So I appreciate that. One thing that stood out to me that I didn't realize until later was that these containers, I thought this was just a standard drop shadow around the containers. But if I zoom in here, you can see it's actually I wouldn't call it solid, but it's basically not a shadow. It's basically an extra border that's got a transparency applied, and it goes all the way around the container in a uniform width. And at the full zoom level, I actually think this feels a bit more like a standard drop shadow, and actually that it competes a little bit with the hard border around the containers. I didn't realize this was not a drop shadow until I saw these ones, where it's a bit more obvious that it's this solid strip around. So they could have made them slightly bigger or darker, maybe in this case, to just make it stand out a bit more and make it clearer what the visual style was. This $10 million pattern I quite like, with the grey $10 million behind the title, and because it's a full sentence, $10 million in savings tracked across hundreds of business owners, it works quite well as this sort of combined pattern. And I don't mind how grey the text is, because they've made the text so big that actually it's much easier to read than if it were small and still the same grey. So I'm quite a fan of this contrast in terms of light grey against dark black, but then much bigger $10 million versus the smaller in savings tract. So that's a nice use of contrast in 2 dimensions to make sure it's all readable, but also more visually interesting. And finally, I noticed that this call to action container at the bottom follows the same pattern as, first of all, the buttons. So you can see when you hover over them, you get dark to light, and this is also dark to light. But also the titles. So as I mentioned before, the titles are dark to light. and this is following that. And so it's a nice sort of repetition of the visual style there. Just like the blue "here's something you should notice" pattern, they've kept it consistent, which is nice. And this dark to light sort of always represents the same thing, which is an important message or something you should pay attention to. So here it's a main title, here it's a button you should click on, and here it's the final call to action container, which also contains this button. You can see here the pattern repeated, which is, again, is quite nice. One thing I'd point out is the spacing here. Below this title, above this button, between these three, these look a bit close for comfort to me. And the same here, this whole section, it feels a bit too closely grouped. So it might be nice if they spread that out a bit more.